Act of Succession. In 2473, after a lengthy period of debate, the council passed the Act of Succession, which gave House Davion permanent tenure over the Crucis March Principality and the title of First Prince of the Federated Suns in perpetuity. Henceforth, the reigning Davion prince could choose his own successor, otherwise, the succession would pass automatically to the nearest living blood relative of the last reigning first prince. Detailed laws of succession were included in the Act, starting with the confirmation of Ellen's 5-year-old nephew William as the next heir. Also established was a mechanism to create a regency for an underage, well as similar provisions to regulate the succession in the other marches of the Federated Suns. Though Ellen Davion reigned nearly 30 years after the council passed the Act of Succession, that law was the crowning achievement of her career. Despite the fighting on 3 frontiers, the years of her rule would one day be regarded as a golden age. By 2500, William Davion was 32 years old, a capable heir with broad military, governmental, and political experience. His son and 2 daughters secured his family succession, and the heir was popular with aristocracy and common folk alike. Ellen Davion, now 75 and feeling the full weight of her years-end physical disabilities, was making plans to retire in William's favour. Already she had outlasted 2 Varneys, Richard and his son Thomas. The 20-year-old David Varney, Richard's grandson, was unable to offer serious political opposition even from his princely position on New Syrtis, and so the Davion throne seemed secure. Before stepping down, Ellen sent her nephew on a grand tour of the Federated Suns, a 2-year journey that her poor health had never allowed her to make. While William travelled, his aunt quietly went about preparing the transfer of power. When he returned early in 2502, all was in readiness. In a dignified ceremony before the council, Princess Ellen handed over the post that she had fought so hard to win and to uphold for 3.5 decades. This historic moment marked the first time that the transfer of Davion power occurred without the death of a ruler, as well as the first time that there were no disputes over the succession. Ellen Davion lived until 2510, when she died in her sleep at age 85. Known to history as Ellen the Good, she did more than any other Davion between the time of Paul and Alexander to regain her realm's loyalty and support for House Davion. Women in the 25th century. The rise and fall of individual philosophies, religions, and cultural trends did not leave many marks on the tapestry of Davion history. The neo-Baroque style of art, architecture, and music of the late 24th century meant little to the politics of the time, neither did the general collapse and rebirth of Catholicism in the same period. One of the few trends that was crucial, however, was the changing role of women between 2400 and 2500. Marie Davion, President and Prime Minister of the Federated Suns from 2371 to 2417, was her people's ideal of late 24th century womanhood. She had taken over from her reclusive brother Paul as leader of an interstellar community, watching over it like a maiden aunt, until the new generation was ready to take up the reins of power. Like most women of her day, she had equal opportunities with men. Indeed, she was far better qualified than Paul to rule the Federated Suns. Within the next 50 years, however, the status of woman changed drastically. By 2450, woman's main role had degenerated to that of caring for husbands and children. In an edict passed by James Davion, females were forbidden to serve in any of the purely combat arms of the Federated Suns military, though they might serve as staff officers and other support personnel. A widely circulated study purported to prove that women were unable to use neurohelmets to control mechs because of a deep-seated psychological resistance to union of the feminine mind with any outside force. As in an earlier, less enlightened period of human history, women were defined as the weaker sex, with more and more educational or career opportunities denied them. When Ellen Davion ascended to the post of first prince in 2467, the trend began to reverse itself. Though Ellen came to the job ill-prepared, she rose to meet the challenge in exemplary fashion. Under her guidance, the role of women shifted back to what it had been under Marie. She reversed several laws that excluded her sex from military and other opportunities, and funded independent research that disproved the previous studies on the innate inferiority of women. If anything, the new evidence demonstrated that certain feminine characteristics actually enhanced the effective use of neurohelmets. As a result of Ellen Davion's influence and good example, two of her grandnieces would one day seek to grasp the ring of power for themselves. From the Changing Role of Women, by Frida Ducoy, Successor Press, 2602. William the Fair. He is a man of sound character, honest, and trained to serve the people. You have ye heard of his exploits on the Draconese frontier, as you have heard of his good work in a dozen embassies and missions on my behalf. When I promised this august body that he would be my heir, no one knew what kind of man we had chosen. By the grace of God, we could not have chosen better. Ellen Davion, from a speech before the High Council, 2502. The millennium's midpoint was a transitional era throughout the human sphere. The Rimworld's republic became a hereditary fiefdom of House Ameris in 2488. The extraordinary Sire Iwan McAllister, who would change the course of Curitan history, was born in 2496. In 2501, the erratic Margaret Olsen succeeded the Lyran Commonwealth's competent Stephen Steiner as Archon. The first decade of the new century saw the propagation of Kael Valorix's creed, which would serve as a code of honor first for the Mechwarriors of House Davion, then for Mech pilots everywhere. Meanwhile, the redoubtable Albert Marike was being groomed for leadership of the Free Worlds League. In the midst of all this, Ellen's successor came to the Davion throne in 2502, fully qualified to rule, with an honest character and a depth of experience that made him the most qualified Davion since Reynard. While Ellen Davion had been well loved, her nephew became the darling of his realm. For a decade, he had been actively involved in the government of the Crucis March, performing state functions ranging from service in foreign embassies to his 2-year inspection tour of the Federation. Unfortunately for the Federated Suns, William's reign was destined to be short. For all his ability and training, the chaos that followed him would bring the interstellar community to the brink of dissolution. Several tragic misfortunes marked the reign of William Davion. First was the eruption of a major new war on the Capellan frontier, a conflict that cost the new prince dearly. His only son Edward, a young field officer in a Mech contingent on Royalston, was killed during a hit-and-run Capellan raid in 2508. A regiment fielded by David Varney should have been able to support Edward's unit, but they failed inexplicably to reach the proper coordinates in time to rescue Edward or his comrades from death. Subsequent investigations pronounced the commander of the unit blameless, though accusations of Varney treachery were rife at the time. 3 years later, Sandra Black Davion, Edward's widow, also died in battle when her dropship was destroyed off Avigate. This left Edward's young son Alexander as heir presumptive, with the youth's aunts Laura and Cassandra Davion as alternate choices. In 2511, Cassandra Davion married David Varney, youthful heir to both the Principality of the Capellan March and the Varney aspirations of Richard's day. Because the marriage was a love match, at least on Cassandra's part, Prince William decided that to bless the union would mend the breach in relations between these two old and respected families. William Davion was only 43 years old, leaving plenty of time for young Alexander Davion to grow into his inheritance. No one dreamed that Cassandra's marriage would one day result in a threat to the Davion right of succession. When a virulent plague broke out on New Avalon in 2512, William was stricken. The 10-year prince remained in coma for nearly a week before eventually succumbing to the disease. Just before his death, he regained consciousness only long enough to name Alexander as his heir, but he handed the signet ring of the first prince to Cassandra Varney and his seal to her elder sister Laura. This was taken to indicate that the two aunts would serve as the boy's regents until he came of age. It also elevated David Varney to a position of preeminent influence, which would have a profound effect on later Davion history. Though there were rumors that William had died at the hands of the ambitious Varney, the official pronouncement was death by plague. In March 2512, William Davion was buried with honor on New Avalon while the 5-year-old prince of the Federated Suns looked on. Death of Prince William. Several notable works have analyzed the circumstances surrounding the death of Prince William Davion in 2512. Was it the spotted fever plague or a carefully contrived murder that carried off the prince while still in the prime of life? The question arose within days of his death, when an anonymous pamphlet entitled The Poisoned Prince began to make the rounds of the back streets of Avalon City. William's death occurred as part of one of the worst plagues in the planet's long history, when the mortality rate ran 30% and mass quarantines restricted all contact with the heart of the Federation. Just 10 days before being stricken, Prince William had insisted on visiting an overcrowded hospital in a grand gesture of sympathy with his suffering people. An autopsy proved conclusively that he was suffering from the plague when he died. It is equally true that William's death was surprisingly convenient to David Varney. With Edward, William's heir, dead in battle and Alexander too young to act as prince for at least a decade, it was the perfect time to make his move. Had William lived longer, he might have chosen another heir. Laura Davion, nearer the throne than her younger sister, might have married and brought a new faction into the picture, perhaps producing a line to rival Varney's claim to power. Perhaps Alexander's popularity might have become strong enough to prevent the Varney faction from acting, or the accusations of treachery against Varney after Edward's death might have been renewed. William's death removed many obstacles to Varney's aspirations, and it followed suspiciously close on the heels of Varney's marriage to Cassandra Davion. Yet, this interpretation of events is perhaps too obvious. David Varney barely won the council's approval to retain his seat as Prince of the Capellan March, and was forced to rely on Cassandra to carry out the duties of the regency. Had it been his own plot, Varney would surely have waited until his power over his wife was more complete. When they entered into the regency, the two were decidedly unequal partners, with Varney always the lesser. Neither was Varney ever in a position to exercise real control over the succession. Had Alexander died first, there would have been no question of a regency and thus a fair chance of winning the principality without further ado. David Varney may have conspired for the throne, but the evidence suggests that it was only after Prince William's death opened the way. To believe that William was murdered is to suggest that David Varney was a fool willing to execute an ill-conceived, poorly prepared plot. Few people, then or now, have ever called David Varney a fool. From History's Stepchild, The Story of House Varney, by Ellen Jablonski, Interstellar Press, 2743. Civil War. By the time of Prince William, the strain of managing a multi-world, multi-interest combine had finally become too much for the Federated Suns government to handle. Each new crisis had shaped the Federation for good or ill, but each solution contained the seeds for new and unexpected problems. A parallel in Terra's own remote history might be the Roman Empire, where political systems had to adapt constantly to the facade of a stable, unchanging state. As late as the reign of Rome's 30 tyrants, that state was known as a republic, deferring to the propaganda but not the proclivities of its powerful first citizens. It was much the same in the Federated Suns during the reigns of Ellen and William. From Davion, Curator and Marike, The Rival Houses of the Inner Sphere, by Thellos Orborn, Commonwealth Historical Press, 3026. In the 88 years between the death of William Davion in 2512 and the dawn of the 27th century, the Federated Suns was governed, in name if not in fact, by one Davion, Prince Alexander. William's grandson and a pivotal figure in Davion history, Alexander inherited the throne of the Crucice March when he was but a child of 5 years. Within the long reign of this brilliant ruler, the Federated Suns would teeter on the brink of dissolution as well as reach the heights of power. The early years of his reign were a time of devastating civil wars. The ultimate outcome of his reign was peace and planetary prosperity that gave the Federated Suns a strong voice in the new Star League. It was quite an accomplishment for a man who spent 5 years of his reign a fugitive with barely enough power to raise a single company of soldiers. The Regency. It is incredible that the young prince is still alive. The Council of Regents is planning to supplant him, but I think the regents are divided as much against themselves as they are united in their most basic aims. I'll wager that Alexander will live only so long as he is useful, then we shall have a tragic death and a new ruler. Pray God the Federation survives it all. Jose Esteves, Duke of New Andalusia, from a letter written 3 weeks before his arrest for treason, 2518. Prince Alexander's aunts, Laura Davion and Cassandra Varney, were the heads of the Council of Regents, which would rule while Alexander was still too young to handle the affairs of his realm. Under the Act of Succession passed during the Ellen Davion era, the two aunts were each permitted to choose another regent, with the High Council appointing a 5th member. Cassandra Varney selected her husband, David, while Laura Davion chose the well-respected General Nikolai Rostov, a powerful military leader. After a lengthy debate, the High Council appointed Carmen Esteves Davion, William's widow, as the 5th member. Though only 43, the Dowager Princess of Davion was an invalid, crippled by strokes suffered in the wake of the sudden deaths of husband, son, and daughter-in-law. Her membership on the council was largely honorary. Some loyalists sought to use her to offset the overweening ambition of the two Davion aunts, but she was never able to muster the energy or the support needed to resist her treacherous daughters. On the day of the funeral ceremonies for Prince William, the backroom struggle for power had already begun among the Council of Regents. David Varney, supported by Cassandra, put forward a motion betrothing the 5-year-old prince to David's 7-year-old niece, Cynthia. He also sought to have Cynthia named as heir apparent in case of Prince William's death. He claimed that this would prevent her Davion regent from plotting her own advancement at the prince's expense. The latter motion was voted down, but General Rostov had backed the betrothal motion against Laura's protests. As it turned out, his was the surer instinct. As long as the Varneys were hoping for a union with the prince, their tactics would be less brutal. This bought time for Laura and the general, who lacked the power base that the Varneys enjoyed because of their holdings on New Sirtis. During the Regency years, the regents openly exercised power in pursuit of personal goals. The High Council's hopes for moderation were dashed when the Dowager Princess retired into seclusion on New Andalusia, granting complete control of her vote to Laura Davion. From that point on, Rostov was the real key to the Regency, as he held the deciding vote in any dispute. When he and Laura voted together to make her Prince of the Draconis March in place of the childless Prince Vladimir Kerensky, Laura got the power base she needed to offset the Varney princedom in the Capellan March. Surprisingly, the Varneys themselves proposed Rostov as Prince of the Terran March in 251-5, after Prince Charles Leighton and his immediate family died during a Terran raid on Robinson. Laura could not oppose the move for fear of alienating Rostov. She could never fully trust him again, however, for he was now as much in debt to her rivals as he was to her. Moreover, ongoing problems on the Terran frontier kept the new prince busy leading military forces instead of involved in politics on New Avalon. By 2517, the lines were well drawn. The Prince of the Outer March, junior of the five princes, found it expedient to steer a neutral course. He could never completely ignore the wishes of the Varnays, however, for they controlled many trading partners and key merchant routes into his territory. Meanwhile, Laura Davion was growing increasingly isolated as Rostov began to play an increasingly independent game. The last bid for sanity came from the High Council, who once again sought to use the Dowager Princess as a focal point. The effort came much too late, for she died in 2518. Almost immediately, Varna's ubiquitous Secret Service agents began to report evidence of a plot to overthrow the regents, presumably led by the most prominent of the High Council moderates. First to be accused was Josix Estevas, the late Dowager Princess's cousin and the most charismatic of the moderate leaders. It did not take long for the cries of treason to become widespread throughout the government. The treason trials of 2518 to 2520 purged the High Council of most moderates and a large proportion of the law-racists as well, though the Varnays were careful to avoid persecuting anyone who might have connections with Rostov. With the general's power growing steadily, the two Varnays were reluctant to make him an enemy without first trying to secure him as a friend. Varnay versus Davion. Aside from bloodshed and political terror, the treason trials left another legacy. With the Dowager Princess dead, there were now only 4 regents, with equal votes in the management of the Federated Suns. The High Council had the right to name a replacement for Princess Carmen, but Varnay's political influence and Rostov's military strength kept faint-hearted councillors from exercising their prerogative. Rather than offend one side or the other, the council refused to name a new regent, leaving the 4 survivors in contention. Winning Rostov's permanent support was the Varnays' best hope of defeating Laura's faction. Laura also courted the bluff soldiers' support. Meanwhile, she stubbornly maintained that her power to act in Princess Carmen's name had been an outright transfer of regency authority and not, as most claimed, a simple delegation of voting power that lapsed with the princess's death. Once again, the High Council was reluctant to take a stand until a winner emerged in this struggle for control of the state. This, in turn, only served to magnify Rostov's importance. Rostov's power rested not on the weak reed of politics, but on the solid foundation of his popularity with the army. In a series of campaigns on the Terran frontier, Rostov had stopped Terra's military forces cold, thanks more to brilliant strategy than to high-quality troops or equipment. In the event of open civil war, Rostov's reputation as a military leader would surely attract the widespread support of soldiers throughout the realm. David Varnay's ill-managed effort to earn equal fame on the Capellan border in 2521 only underlined Rostov's skill and influence. In that same year, Laura won Rostov back into her camp when she proposed that he be named First Marshal of the Federated Suns, an extraordinary military command that would supersede all other military posts in all 5 principalities. Because the vote on Rostov's command came up while David Varnay was still away on the Capellan front, it was Cassandra who decided on her own to vote against Rostov. This act of bad judgment jeopardized everything for which she and her husband had worked up until now. Her vote not only failed to block Rostov's appointment, but also created ill will. Alexander was 15 years old as these tensions began to mount. While he was growing up in his father's palace on New Avalon, the regents had kept him largely cut off from affairs of state. It had been the Varnays, for the most part, who had controlled access to the young prince, and they had sought to turn him into a spoiled young tyrant with no interest in government. Alexander, however, disliked his aunt Cassandra and actively hated David Varnay because one of his nurses had hinted at Varnay's complicity in his father's death. He sought solace in the study of warfare, strategy, and tactics, and the memoirs of Simon, Reynard, Paul, and Ellen Davion, the family's great statesman. By the time he was in his teens, Alexander had resolved that he would avenge his father and put his power-hungry relatives in their place. With the single-minded drive characteristic of his line, Alexander kept his plan secret, played the part of the foppish prince, and bided his time. Foiled in their bid to win Rostov's support, the Varnays proved that they too could play the waiting game. It was not until a border clash with the Draconis March occupied Marshal Rostov's attention in 2523 that they forced a confrontation. They kidnapped young Alexander from New Avalon and carried him off to New Syrtis, ostensibly so that he might tour the realm, as his grandfather had done before Ellen's retirement. In fact, they never permitted Alexander to leave their capital where, early in 2524, the 17-year-old prince was married to Cynthia Varnay. This gave Cynthia a solid claim to the princely throne, though the Varnays looked forward to the birth of a blood heir to make their stake even stronger. Faced with this unexpected coup, Laura Davion hastily made a separate peace with the Draconis combined so that Rostov could mobilize for a showdown. The battle that would decide the destiny of the Federated Suns seemed at hand. In all his calculations and schemes, David Varnay had made one serious mistake. He misjudged the relative importance of family versus spouse in the mind of his niece, Cynthia Varnay, now Davion. Unlike her aunt and uncle, Cynthia was not ambitious. Though born of strong-willed, domineering stock, Cynthia nevertheless refused to play the role that fate had handed her. In their first year of wedded life, Cynthia and Alexander discovered a love for one another, a development as unexpected as it was unwelcome to the Varnay power brokers. Cynthia did not learn how disposable her new husband was until she reported her pregnancy in August of 2524. On that day, she discovered that the male heir she carried would, if safely delivered, be Alexander's death warrant. On that day, she also rejected her family's ambitions forever. Henceforth, she would become the prince's most vital ally, the only one on whom he might rely through the dark years to come. Instead of being known as a pawn in the Varnays' game, Cynthia Varnay Davion's name has become synonymous with one of history's most romantic love stories. 3 Roses. Alexander was away in the Capellan March and Cynthia was at home for health reasons. I was her guest in the palace on New Avalon, invited, I suspect, to keep Cynthia company during Alexander's absence. It was the first time since their marriage that they had been separated. Cynthia, always an early riser, asked me to a sunrise breakfast on the eastern balcony. She looked worn and lacked her usual vivacity, but seemed to be in a reflective and confiding mood. "You've heard how my family plotted against Alexander when we were first married," she said, spreading passion fruit compote on her toast. "Would you like to hear how he took the news when I broke it to him?" "Whatever you choose to tell me I will hold in strictest confidence," I assured her. She ignored my remark. "As you know, my Uncle David intended for Vincent to be his opportunity to seize power. Alexander was to be killed and Uncle David appointed royal protector as soon as Vincent was born. I was thrilled to tell people that I was pregnant. I don't think that I was ever happier, but Uncle David's reaction. He literally wrung his hands with delight. He was saying things like, 'Congratulations. How nice for you,' but the message in his eyes said something else. So I knew there was something going on. I also knew I couldn't ask him outright, but I said some vague things about him helping us plan the baby's future, and his plan all came out. I was furious. You can imagine how I felt. I don't know what was worse, being used as a pawn in my husband's assassination, or being thought of as a political baby machine with no instincts of my own. That afternoon, when Alexander arrived home, I told him everything. I didn't know beforehand how I would do it, but when the time came, it all came out matter-of-factly, like I was one of his agents making a report. He listened with a surprised, hurt look on his face, and when I was finished, he sighed. "Well, I shouldn't be surprised," he said finally. "Thank you for telling me. I said. Oh, aren't you excited? Angry? Anything? Somehow, he said. I can't be upset. I have you. Cynthia sighed, staring at the hillsides on the horizon. Before then, I could have forgiven Uncle David. She sipped her chamna tea and sat silently for a long time. Finally, she said, then, Alexander gave me a gift. He'd had it jumped from terror just for me. Lieutenant was 3 white roses, symbolizing the 3 of us, him, me, and Vincent within me, and I knew that forgiveness would not be part of the picture. Countess Jane Selte Make, 2509 to 2604, from a letter to Hanse Davion, 2553 Comstar Archives. The Regents of War. There are worlds besides Certis or Fair Avalon, and subjects still loyal despite Vermeil's wrong. Brave citizen soldiers 10,000 men strong will follow the banner of young Davion. Chorus. So ready the vessel, make ready to lift, plot coordinates to jump through the barrier rift. Tonight starts the journey, 'twill ever live on of the proud princely banner of young Davion. Then away to Noni, to Marsham to mud. For I yield to the regents, I will shed my life's blood. Tremble, false Vermeil, you see more anon of the bold sunburst banner of young Davion. From the banner of young Davion, as recorded in Songs of the Crucice March, compiled by Edward Monroe, 2896. Alexander escapes. Soon after discovering her uncle's plans, Cynthia Davion shared the information with her all but captive husband. They hatched their own plot to evade Varney, taking advantage of Varney's increasing concern with affairs in the Crucice and Draconis marches. Here, Marshal Rostov, ably backed by his dynamic son Dmitri, had settled the disputes with the Federated Suns as neighbors in order to concentrate completely on internal affairs. Late in 2524, an elite strike force of dropships and mechs landed on New Avalon as escort to Laura Davion. This show of military might cowed the High Council. Still maintaining her right to Carmen's vote as well as her own, and supported by Marshal Rostov, Laura announced that the Varneys had kidnapped the first prince. She proclaimed them enemies of the state, regents no longer. Those councillors who had not already fled Newavalon loyally acclaimed these decisions and declared war on the traitors who were holding the young prince against his will. In answer, the Varneys assembled their own rump council on New Certis. They declared that the occupation of New Avalon was itself treasonous, and in the name of the prince, urged that a militia army be mustered against Laura and the regular army. The battle lines were drawn at last. The first months of 2525 were a calm before the storm. Alexander, who was approaching his 18th birthday, was still more of an asset than a liability to the Varney faction. By Federated Suns custom, he would not enter into his majority until he turned 20. In the meantime, he would serve as a useful symbol of legitimacy until Cynthia bore him a son who would be an even more potent symbol. To counter the stories of enforced captivity on New Certis, Alexander was permitted to accompany his uncle on a tour of Capella March worlds where troops and mechs were being mustered. The fact that this would keep the young prince away from both his wife and his aunt at the time of his son's birth was a part of Varney's planning. Though he was unaware of Cynthia's betrayal, Varney did know that neither she nor Cassandra were ready to see Davion killed outright. Varney would save that part of his plan until he was sure that there was a living heir to the princely union. Cynthia and Alexander had not been idle, however. Though Alexander's tour would separate them, it assured his escape from certain death. Cynthia had already made contact with anti-Varney elements in the Capellan March. As soon as the prince's itinerary was known, she notified her contacts, who set a plan in motion. It was at Skullmune, third stop on the tour, that Alexander made his move. The news David Varney had been waiting for reached them in early May 2525. Cynthia had given birth to a male child, and named him Vincent, as she and her husband had previously agreed. This good news was the signal for Alexander's escape. Varney could not prevent popular celebrations of the event, for the legitimacy of his cause hinged upon it. Neither could he openly turn on Alexander if that cause was to have a future. Thus, the young prince had enough freedom of movement to be smuggled onto a ship manned by supposed members of Varney's scout fleet. From there, he escaped off-world before the Prince of the Capellan March could react. By the time Varney discovered what had happened, it was too late to stop Alexander, who was safely outward bound. At the same moment, Laura's forces launched an assault against Clun that threatened to tear the Capellan March in half. Bait and switch. Rostov's idol was the Russian general Kutuzov, who defeated Napoleon during the latter's invasion of Russia. Using a variant of the famous General George Washington's principle of strategic retreat to prevent a less mobile army from establishing effective supply lines, Kutuzov pioneered a policy known as scorched earth, which called for retreat into the vast Asian continent while destroying everything of value. Though this was hard on the peasant class, whose farms were burned, the maneuver kept Napoleon's armies overextended. In one of the most bitter chapters in human history, the French army ultimately starved Umfraus in the severest winter in Russian history. Rostov's favorite strategy was another variant on Washington's and Kutuzov's strategies. Named after a practice popular with dishonest merchants, the bait-and-switch tactic also relied on strategic retreat into vast wilderness lands to throw an opponent off balance. The object was to lay a trap for an enemy bent on easy plunder. On the planet Talcott, for instance, Rostov pretended to flee superior Varneyist forces from nearby Salem. When the pursuers jumped into the Talcott system, they discovered that the defending forces had disappeared into the verdant farmlands of the planet. They foraged the land to replenish their food stocks and notified General Varney that Rostov's forces had disappeared. Varney wired back, as Rostov knew he would, that Rostov's forces were too significant to be overlooked, and ordered a thorough search of the planet. Rostov's strategy became a waiting game. Rostov was taking a huge gamble. Knowing that his forces would be planet-bound for some time, he turned off his heat-generating equipment, whose traces would have led Varney's troops straight to him. He knew the time had come to move when he intercepted an enemy message that Varney himself was coming to lead the search. While the enemy was preoccupied with preparations for the arrival of their commanding general, Rostov mobilized his troops for a lightning raid on the Varneyist camp. With the element of surprise on their side and with Varney's troops exhausted from searching, Rostov's troops easily overpowered the Varneyists, crippling their forces and destroying their newly acquired stores of provisions. Then they disappeared back into the wilderness. Varney arrived to find his troops decimated and that Rostov had simply vanished from the face of the planet. David Varney was no fool, however. He realized that Rostov had found a way to make any invasion force on Talcott a sitting duck. Blooded but unbowed, he evacuated the remainder of his expeditionary force, vowing that it would be Rostov who would fall into a trap the next time they met. From Honorable Enemies, Generals of the Inner Sphere, by Marek Mirenchel, Persian National Press, 2989. Alexander in exile. As the prince and his rescuers passed through the barrier rift that formed the frontier between the Capellan and Crucice marches, Rostov's veterans were cutting a wide swath through Varney's poorly trained militia troops. During the assault on Quitakers, however, Marshal Rostov himself was killed. The death of the old war horse of the Terran March was a shocking blow to the army's morale, which Varney turned to his own advantage with fast thinking and typically underhanded intervention. Well-placed bribes bought him a whole series of mutinies and desertions in the ranks of Laura's main fighting force, and her offensive ground to a halt within a few weeks. Rostov's son Dmitry, now 45 and a brilliant tactician in his own right, was cut off deep behind Varney lines when desertion wiped out his whole line of communication. Rather than surrender, he disbanded his troops and fled with a handful of mechs, seeking safety from the sudden groundswell of support for David Varney. This was far from the end of the Civil War. Though much of her frontline army had disintegrated, Laura still commanded the main body of Federated Suns troops and had at least nominal loyalty from all but those from the Capellan March. Varney had won an essentially bloodless victory, but it had been costly. Varney now lacked the resources or the trained troops to carry the war into Laura's territory. For the moment, things were at stalemate, though fighting continued in desultory fashion along the worlds lining the barrier rift. It was here, on the planet Noni, that young Prince Alexander had hidden himself in self-imposed exile. He knew that it was only a matter of time before his chance would come to avenge himself against the regents, each of whom wished to seize Alexander's power for himself. Alexander lay low for nearly a year and a half, celebrating his coming of age in the swamp encampment where he and a handful of followers had taken refuge. Both sides had declared him dead, each accusing the other of his murder. Both knew, however, that he had only disappeared, and were secretly scouring the Federated Suns for his trail. Realizing that his life was forfeit no matter which faction won the war, Alexander lived like an outlaw bandit while pondering how he could recover the throne. Victor of Noni. Early in 2527, elements of the 1st New Avalon Dragoons, a light armor regiment, were stationed on Noni while Laura mounted yet another strike into Varney space. The Dragoons were not among her favorite troops. Colonel Gordon, their commander, had openly proclaimed that his loyalty was to New Avalon and the Crucice Prince before all else, and that his service to Laura was because of her hold on New Avalon rather than to any rights or merit of hers. Laura had stationed the Dragoons on this dreary, unimportant world and was keeping the regiment on short rations and supporting them only minimally to lure Varney to attack and thus wipe out the regiment. In one stroke, this would eliminate an irritant while placing the enemy directly in the path of a well-planned counterstroke. Alexander, of course, knew nothing of Laura's strategy. He had heard of the regiment's loyalties, though he knew their morale was low. Determined to test the power of the Davion name on 24 January 2527, he set out for the Dragoon headquarters with only 10 companions. The risk paid off. Gordon and his men enthusiastically hailed Alexander when he unfurled the sunburst banner on the hill overlooking the camp and proclaimed himself the rightful prince of the Crucice March. The prince now had an ill-supplied but eager regiment of regular troops at his command. Within 2 weeks, he would also have a chance to test their mettle when Varney finally took Laura Davion's bait. He sent 2 divisions of Capellan March militia, strengthened by 2 full regiments of BattleMechs, to occupy Noni. Several factors conspired in Alexander's favor during the attack. The terrain of Noni, mostly vast expanses of bogs, hampered the movements of both infantry and mechs. Because the Dragoons were equipped with jump infantry and hovercraft for scouting and support, they enjoyed an advantage over their opponents in this terrain. Also, Gordon's men were regulars pinned against a mostly ill-trained militia force. Finally, the mere presence of Alexander was worth a full regiment in morale value alone, regardless of his experience as a military man. In an inspired guerrilla campaign, Alexander and his troops withdrew deep into the marshes, striking out of the mists at isolated enemy columns floundering in the bogs. After 2 months of gradual retreat, Gordon broke off from the main body of Alexander's force with 2 hover tank companies. In a surprise attack, he encircled the advancing enemy forces and destroyed their base camp and landing facilities. The Varney commander, General Boethers, was forced to surrender for lack of supplies. Almost a full regiment, including 4 Mechwarrior units, switched sides when they learned the identity of the victor of Noni. The remainder were held ransom while Boniface went to New Syrtis to report Alexander's terms. In exchange for the men, mechs, and ships taken at Noni, the Prince of the Crucice March demanded his wife and his son. If David Varney had been on New Syrtis when General Boniface arrived with Alexander's message, it is likely that he would have refused the trade. Cassandra Varney was another story. Under pressure from members of her council, who had relatives captive on Noni, she agreed to Alexander's terms instead of responding with an ultimatum threatening the prince's family. Cassandra decided that she could not afford to lose any more resources to the enemy. She quickly dispatched Cynthia and Vincent Davion to Noni with Boniface, who was instructed to retreat from the planet with everything he could salvage. Boniface arrived only 2 days before the start of the second Noni campaign. Laura Davion, whose intelligence service had belatedly delivered the news of the Varney offensive, was unaware of Alexander's presence, much less of his victory. Her plan to trap Varney's troops thus went into motion on the assumption that the enemy was present in force. Having concluded his trade with Boniface, Alexander had faded into the marshes before Laura's force made planetfall. While Boniface struggled to improvise some defense against these new foes, the prince attacked one of Laura's columns and won another victory. Meanwhile, more Crucice units from Laura's army went over to the young prince's banner. Though this gave him the nucleus of a fair-sized armed force, he was still desperately short of mechs. Whether Alexander's generalship was faulty or whether pressure from his supporters outweighed his better judgment, he accepted a full-scale battle against Laura's forces on ground that gave her mechs a decided advantage. Even so, the Battle of Davion Hill might have ended in a victory for Alexander if General Boniface had not brought his troops to attack the prince's rear, violating the terms of the trade he had effected barely 2 weeks before. The fact that Varney's men were as eager to attack Laura's troops as Alexander's allowed the prince to pull out his senior officers, mechs, and 250 infantry and armor troops before his line disintegrated. Crucice dropships in Laura's flotilla were as eager to aid their prince as the fighting soldiers had been, which permitted Alexander and his followers to flee the Noni system while the other two factions continued the battle behind him. It had been an inauspicious start, but the earlier victories at Noni more than outweighed the final defeat. The emergence of Prince Alexander was heralded far and wide, and so were the stories of Boniface's first defeat and subsequent treachery. Alexander's cause had suffered no more than a setback. He was still a force to be reckoned with as the Davion civil war moved into a new, more devastating phase. When Dmitry Rostov learned that the prince was alive, he and his own band of refugees promptly transferred their allegiance from Laura to Alexander. 6 months after the prince fled Noni, the younger Rostov had raised the sunburst banner on Farewell. Word that the son of the Federated Suns' beloved marshal had thrown in his lot with the Davion prince spread like wildfire across the Crucice March, winning Alexander the support of many regular army units. Meanwhile, Prince Alexander was traveling with Colonel Gordon and the other survivors of Noni to promote his cause from world to world. At first, they often had to dodge Laura's troops, but by the middle of 2528, Laura and her forces were pulling out of the Crucice territory. The prince's cause was too strong in the Davion's hereditary realm. Laura Davion withdrew into her own Draconis March to regroup and organize a renewed effort. As for the Terran March, it had split. The younger Rostov carried great authority as his father's successor to the principality, but Laura's close ties to the marshal were not easily forgotten. The Rostov family still lacked the lineage to command the kind of loyalty that the Davions enjoyed in the Crucice March. Struggle for the throne. Pray God this is really the end of it all. No throne is worth what we've paid today. Prince Alexander Davion, after the Battle of Robinson, 2540. Alexander's campaign. There was no longer any hope for a peaceful solution. Laura and Cassandra had each proclaimed herself rightful first prince of the Federated Suns, ignoring Alexander's hereditary claim. From now on, there will be no more pretense of legitimacy in their campaigns. These two women realized that only naked force would bring them power, now that intrigue and politics had failed. From 2528 to 2530, there was a lull in the civil war while each faction gathered strength and cleared away internal dissension. By 2530, the war was ready to heat up again. Fortunately for Alexander Davion, fate took a turn of its own. David Varney, 50 years old and the most dangerous of the young prince's opponents, was killed during the riots against the Varneys on Ashley. Though strong-willed and determined, Cassandra was no strategist, and she was overburdened with the task of holding together the remnants of the Varney cause. With the Varneys temporarily at bay, the prince concentrated his attention against Laura Davion, now based around Tancredi, her Draconis March capital and chief stronghold. Alexander promoted Colonel John Gordon to the rank of general and charged him with keeping the Varney frontier secure while the main army moved the other way. Gordon accomplished this in a series of brilliant guerrilla campaigns that were to become legend among Mechwarriors. Though Gordon rarely commanded more than a handful of mechs, he consistently defeated much larger forces through superior use of tactics and terrain. He raided, attacked, and harassed, but always resisted the urge to settle into a prolonged campaign on any one planet. Through these actions, Gordon kept Cassandra Varney's forces hamstrung while his master settled accounts in the Draconis March. Here, much of the glory went to Dmitry Rostov. Though not the commander his father was, the Rostov name alone was enough to win support from regular army forces in the Draconis March. Nevertheless, the campaign for the March went slowly, due mostly to the significantly different goals held by the Prince and General, Rostov. For example, Rostov's first moves were aimed at consolidating his hold on the Terran March rather than on combating Laura's main forces. Alexander needed Rostov too much to do more than plead with him to finish off Laura's force and to strike at New Syrtis while the Capellan March was in disarray. What General Gordon might have accomplished in months took Alexander and Rostov 2 years to finish. In the end, however, a massive Davion strike force landed on Tancredi and decisively defeated the cream of Laura's remaining troops in 2533. Alexander's elder aunt took her own life when she saw the dust cloud raised by Alexander's mechs and armored troops approaching her command post. Her senior surviving military officer, General Katrinka, surrendered on behalf of the Draconis March the following day. Rostov's plan. 2 years of delays had been costly on the Capellan front, however. Gordon's successes had been impressive, but Cassandra Varney was finally rallying support. More important, she had enlisted the services of a large number of mercenaries from the Capellan Confederation. Rumor had it that Cassandra offered to cede large chunks of the Capellan March to House Davion in exchange for this support, though both parties hotly denied any such bargain. The year 2533 saw a resurgence of Varney power. Eventually, Cassandra's forces isolated General Gordon and his small force by keeping them under siege on the planet Jaipur. Alexander had to act quickly, launching a hasty attack to relieve the pressure on his most loyal commander. Dmitry Rostov pleaded to remain in his own march to continue putting down pockets of law-based resistance and to keep watch on the Draconis and Terran borders. The prince was left to rely on his own abilities and distinctly second-rate troops in the campaign to rescue Gordon. Not surprisingly, the rescue attempt failed, and Gordon was eventually forced to surrender his troops. When brought to trial for war crimes by Cassandra Varney, the young general was condemned to death and executed. Most of his troops were similarly slaughtered. The long years of civil war were breeding savagery on both sides, however, for one of Alexander's battalions retaliated by unleashing mass destruction on the Varney planet of Smolensk. It seemed that the Ars conventions held only for disputes between the major states, but not for wars within them. Laura's farewell. There are those who will ask why. Some will say that I despair because my forces cannot win the war, but that is not the reason. Some will also believe I cannot bear to live with the frustration of never being able to rule the Federated Suns. Others may say that I regret the loss of so many of my faithful troops in pursuit of a now doomed cause. I assure you that although I appreciate the loyalty and courage of my troops, I hold that they entered into a bargain with me to fight in return for good government, and possibly for the rewards I would show them if victorious. They made a good bargain but a bad bet. There may even be some who will suggest that I fear pain, imprisonment, or execution if I am captured. Those who say so simply do not know me. I despair over the direction that the Federated Suns will take without my guidance and wonder what will happen to it now. Laura Davion, from her 26-page suicide note, November 27, 2533. Warts and all. The family scandal in the years before the Civil War was that Cassandra had a son out of wedlock before she married David Varney. While Varney refused to recognize the child, although there was no doubt as to his paternity, Davion was actually the first of the Varney pretenders. He was not, however, ambitious, and never made any claim of his own to the seat of power. The only people who ever recognized him as being the legitimate ruler of the Federated Suns were the power brokers of House Davion, who saw him as a pliant, politically naive young man who would make a good match for their dynamic young chancellor, Davion. The benefits of such a state marriage for both realms were obvious, but it was not to be. First, Davion was a connoisseur of delicate and beautiful things in all aspects of her life, and had warts on his face, something Davion could not abide. More important, the man was never really accepted as a potential leader, even within his own family. Even if he had been, a state marriage between Trull and Davion would have embroiled the Capellan Confederation in the Davion Civil War. With everything to lose and little to gain, Trull would have had to oppose both the Davion and the Varney factions in the fight. Although he was given every advantage accorded to the ruling family's children and he maintained cordial relations with both sides of the family throughout his short life, no mean trick, Davion has, for 500 years, never been granted a place in the Davion family tree. From Pretenders Past and Present, by Gina Fortunato, Comstar Publications, 3021. Cassandra Varney's success encouraged Tyr to muster her forces for an all-out thrust against the Crucice March. From 2534 through 2536, her troops made a slow but systematic advance, taking Crucice worlds one by one. El Dorado, one of the oldest and most important Federated Suns planets, fell late in 2536, putting Varney in a strong position for a direct assault on New Avalon itself. Through it all, Rostov remained concerned mainly for his own principality, and seemed to become even more intractable as the years passed. He was a more skillful politician than his father, however, and kept just enough reinforcements flowing into Alexander's camp to keep the prince from giving up on Rostov's support. Early in 2537, Rostov and a small honor guard finally put in a dramatic personal appearance at the prince's field headquarters on Belladonna. During their meeting, Alexander and Rostov could barely conceal their mutual contempt. Upon learning of the size of Rostov's force, the prince replied irritably, "I could have done with a few more men and a lot less Rostov." For his part, the general condemned the prince's conduct of the campaign. "Why aren't you attacking?" he demanded. "I'd be attacking all along the front. I'd be fighting anywhere one of them stood. Battles are not won by watching the enemy take your worlds." Though this bickering was an inauspicious send-off for a crucial campaign, Rostov had a plan that soon turned into a classic of modern military strategy. The general informed Alexander that he had amassed an even more substantial army at Smolensk on the edge of the Capellan March. While Cassandra Varney advanced slowly through the Crucice March, Rostov proposed that Alexander's army move to one flank of the Varney line of advance while his army threatened the other. They would leave New Avalon wide open. The object was for the two Davion armies to smash through Cassandra Varney's line of supply and to unite behind her main strike force. This would force her to turn and fight at a disadvantage, or else watch her force slowly fail apart from lack of supplies, ammunition, and spare parts. Like most modern armies, Varney's troops could not operate without a source for equipment. Rostov's plan was executed brilliantly. In a series of strikes, he and Alexander reclaimed all the jump routes outward from El Dorado before the Varney forces even knew what was happening. Cassandra was forced to turn and attempt to break out back toward her own march, but Alexander and Rostov forced her fleet to battle in space over the planet Megan. The superior Davion forces decimated the Varney fleet. Though some elements landed for a last-ditch fight on the planetary surface, most scattered. Cassandra Varney escaped, but Alexander's subsequent victory of Megalon ended the Varney threat once and for all. In his first proclamation as undisputed master of the Federated Suns, Prince Alexander Davion gave the planet Megalon the new name of Victoria. Varney did not even attempt to rally her forces at New Syrtis, but fled into the Capellan Confederation with the remnants of the Lyran mercenaries. Though the civil war was over for now, Cassandra Varney would never give up hope, for she had given birth to a son only a few months before David Varney's death in 2530. The child was now 7 years old. The task facing Alexander in 2537 was immense. The Civil War had ruined whole planets, brought the Federated Suns' economy to a near standstill, and resulted in millions of deaths on over 100 worlds. Some rebellious pockets still remained, and the High Council was only a shadow of its former self. Worst of all, though, was that the surviving Federated Suns leaders were unwilling to accept the reforms called for by this massive destruction. Many resented the fact that the young prince, only 30 years old, was determined to take a firm hand in the reconstruction of all 5 marches, not just in his own Crucice March.